I recently watched a video by Madisun Gray called The Toxic Side of Slow Living. And while I wouldn't go as far as calling the slow living lifestyle toxic, having changed my lifestyle over the past 3+ years from city urban girl to rural woods nature lover, I can definitely attest to the fact of some realities of living this type of lifestyle versus the fairy tale representations we sometimes see and dream about on YouTube of the perfect picturesque life in a garden somewhere with absolute peace and quiet all of the time, or a stress-free cottage off-grid adventure. Don't get me wrong, I love the slow living movement, and doing what I can to simplify my life day by day is absolutely essential to my overall well-being. But like anything else, there are always pros and cons to every life choice. So, if you're someone who is dreaming of this type of lifestyle, or perhaps already living it, and can relate to what I'm saying, then keep watching. I think a lot of us came to the realization that the so-called obligations of constant productivity, 24/7 connection, and buying more to feel better just wasn't cutting it for us anymore. We crave something more sustainable and more meaningful. But as Madisun points out, even this beautiful lifestyle can have its misconceptions, and I've lived through a few of them myself. Let's start with the idea that slow living is always restful. So when we moved away from the city over 3 years ago to live closer to nature and slow down the pace of our lives a little more, at first it was like living this dream, and it was such a novelty being closer to the woods, learning how to operate a tractor to mow our lawn, not having to look directly into the windows of nosy neighbors who lived directly across the street from us. It felt like freedom, with so much space and privacy. Having a family of 4, we decided to live off-grid enough, because it just wasn't practical for us to be living so far away from others to be completely isolated. And while we have no regrets about our decision to move away from the hustle and bustle of city life, here's the truth. It's not always the peaceful utopia it looks like on YouTube. For example, and I've mentioned this in some of my past videos that I'll leave the links to in the description below, at first I thought by simply moving out here to a place like this, it would be enough to give me peace and quiet, except for one tiny oversight. Working remotely from home for the first 2 years out here, in an incredibly fast-paced online work culture, was simply like bringing the 24/7 constant productivity of the city with me in my suitcase. And while I had the lovely scenery to look at outside my window, I really wasn't enjoying it as much as I could have, and felt just as stressed out and overwhelmed as I would have if I just remained in the city. This certainly wasn't restful, and it taught me that simplifying my life and slowing down is so much more than just a change in our environment. It's a mind shift. So I made some decisions in order to truly embrace the type of lifestyle I was aiming for, which involved some sacrifices to honor my values, and gave up some material success and truly appreciate what I already had instead of the constant consumerism of buying more stuff to be happy just because I could, and really live the concept of less being more. Another example of the misconception that a slow life is always restful was realizing that out here, when the power or water goes out, and it has, we're pretty much on our own. And when the power goes out here, it's usually for days, not minutes or even hours like we were accustomed to in the city, which rarely happened, I might add. We've had days with no well water, no electricity, and a sump pump threatening to overflow because it needs power to operate. And in fact did overflow during the ice storm back in March that I've mentioned in other videos, causing our basement to flood. As a result, our basement is now undergoing lots of repairs, And there's always cleanup. Down branches, heavy limbs, clearing paths. There's a lot of physical work involved in living closer to the land. It's beautiful, but it's not effortless. And I would imagine the more off-grid you live, the more you really need to be able to depend on yourself when weather strikes or equipment like generators don't operate properly. I'll be honest with you. During the ice storm, when our basement flooded, I wondered if we had really made the right move leaving the city and all its conveniences. Although in my heart, I know we did. Especially on a recent drive to the city we had with all of the overwhelming traffic. Every time something unexpected happens out here, like a flooding basement, I remember why we chose this. It wasn't for absolute convenience. It was for the space to breathe. For sunrises we can actually see. For quiet that restores something deep in our hearts and minds. And back to the mind shift thing, I choose to learn from these challenges. Learn how to use equipment like backup generators and always have a plan B. In a way, it kind of feels empowering to know how to work things yourself out here versus relying on someone else to do it for you. Another point Madisun made that I'm glad she acknowledged was about slow living with kids, and in my case, teenagers. Let me tell you, I've tried capturing my teens on these videos to show you what life is really like here, but they want absolutely nothing to do with my camera. And I respect that. The closest things I've been able to capture are the backs of their heads. They're like wild creatures sometimes, I swear. They're harder to spot than the moose that pass by our pond each year. But just because they're not in the frame doesn't mean they're not part of my slow and simple living story. And how do you do slow living with kids? Sometimes I watch videos of independent women living by themselves in a cottage somewhere, or off-grid in the woods, or a cute tiny house. And I admit, I catch myself fantasizing about that type of life. But with a household of teenagers, for us, that's just not feasible. But it doesn't mean slow living is impossible. It just looks a little different. For us, it's fewer sit-down crafts or gazing at the sky surrounded by a beautiful meadow. Although I do try to get out and do these things by myself sometimes when I can. With teens, it's more about driving them to a friend's house and savoring the ride, noticing the light on the trees. It's about intentionally slowing down to be present with them on the car ride and teaching them the values of less being more. That we don't need to buy new stuff all the time in order to be happy, and that not everything is on demand. That we can create happiness by the simplest of things, like sitting out on our deck and having conversations as we appreciate the scenery around us. My daughter and I also are avid readers, so sitting with her while reading is also a very special time for us to connect. Finally, Madisun makes a point about the importance of rest, but also the misconception that work is bad. I think anything taken to the extreme, whether it's overworking or over-resting, is out of balance. I still continue to work and be productive during the day. Making these videos takes some work, for example. The type of work we do gives us purpose, but I'm also a firm believer in working smarter and more intentionally, not just harder for harder's sake. I also reject the idea that rest and quiet equals laziness. Rest for me is restoration of my mind, body, and spirit, and prevents burnout. I made a whole video on this a few months ago. I'll also link it below if you'd like to go deeper. But I'll say this here. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing a woman can do is stop. Not because she's weak, but because she's wise. because she knows she cannot pour from an empty cup, and because she remembers that doing everything isn't the same as doing what matters. Slow living isn't an aesthetic or a destination. It's not something you can buy your way into or move across the country to find. It's a mindset, a rhythm, a remembering. So if you're someone contemplating slowing down your life and moving out of the city, I hope this provides you with some more information to reflect on based on our experiences. Or if you're already living this type of life and in a season where slow living feels hard or even messy, know that you're not doing it wrong. You're just doing it honestly. And in the long run, that's what truly nourishes us. I'd love to hear in the comments, what's been the hardest or most surprising part of your own slow living journey? And if you're just beginning, what draws you to this path? Thanks for watching. Here's another video YouTube thinks you'll like. Until next time.